Welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to dive into the really fascinating mechanics of global trade. Have you ever wondered exactly how a local, homegrown business takes that massive and honestly, sometimes terrifying leap to go global? Well, today we are completely demystifying the world of international business and unpacking exactly why and how companies cross borders to expand their horizons.
Okay, let's just dive right into this by meeting a gentleman named Mr. Sudhir Manchanda. Now, he's a small manufacturer of automobile components based over in Gorgon. He employs about 55 workers, and he has a pretty significant 9.2 million rupee investment tied up in his plant and machinery. But right now, Mr. Manchanda is facing a seriously stressful problem. There's a recession hitting his domestic market. And looking at the numbers, he doesn't foresee his domestic sales going up anytime soon. So Mr. Manchanda's son, who actually just finished his business degree, suggests this really bold move, setting up a factory in Bangkok to serve the Southeast Asian market and save on transport costs. But wait, is that actually the right move? How and why should a local business navigate the incredibly complex world of international trade? Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, welcome to the global village. Then, defining international business, domestic versus international trade, the scope of global business, the global advantage, and finally, first steps to going global.
Welcome to the global village. Let's take India, for example, which went through a truly dramatic economic shift. Pre-1991, the country was essentially caught in a severe debt trap, facing a crippling balance of payments crisis. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, had to step in. They agreed to lend money, but only if India underwent massive structural changes. It was basically a forced, yet utterly transformative journey, from an isolated economy to massive structural liberalization. And that led us right to the present day, where national economies are increasingly borderless and fully integrated into this global village. Section 2. Defining international business. So the crucial point here is that international business exists for a very fundamental reason. Nations simply cannot produce equally well or cheaply all the things that they need. Natural resources are totally unequally distributed around the globe. Productivity levels vary drastically because of socioeconomic or political reasons, and the availability of labor and capital, it's completely different depending on exactly where you are on the map.
Which brings us to this really beautiful concept called the territorial division of labor. Think about it domestically first. Within India, West Bengal specializes in jute products, while Maharashtra specializes in cotton textiles. They produce what they're best suited for. Well, this exact same principle applies perfectly to the global stage. Countries produce what they can make efficiently and effectively, and they just procure the rest through trade.
Section 3. Domestic versus international trade. Remember our friend Mr. Manchanda? A friend of his in the tire business gave him this very wise piece of advice. Stepping outside your home country introduces an entirely new, complex set of rules. You literally can't just take your domestic strategy, copy it, and paste it into a foreign market. It just doesn't work that way. There are some major friction points when you compare domestic and international trade. In domestic business, you're dealing with one nationality, one currency, and your labor moves around freely. But internationally, suddenly you are dealing with multiple, fluctuating currencies. The price of your product can change overnight without you doing a single thing. Plus, moving your labor and capital across borders is suddenly highly restricted by all sorts of legal and geographic barriers.
And then, of course, there's the customer. Customer heterogeneity is a massive hurdle. A strategy that works perfectly in one place will fail absolutely miserably in another. For example, consumers in the US tend to replace consumer durables like TVs or bikes every 2 to 3 years. But in India, consumers generally keep those exact same products until they are completely, totally worn out. Not to mention things like language barriers or the simple fact that Americans drive on the right side of the road and Indians on the left. You absolutely have to adapt.
Section 4. The scope of global business. A lot of times, people think international business is just shipping boxes of physical products on huge cargo ships. But it is so much more than that. Yes, we have merchandise, which is the trade of tangible goods, but the scope also encompasses intangibles, intellectual property, and massive financial movements like foreign direct investment, where a company might literally build a whole new plant in another country. You might also hear the term invisible trade, which I think is a fascinating way to describe it. This refers to the import and export of services. So when an airline flies passengers internationally, or a country hosts foreign tourists, or an engineering firm provides consultancy abroad, that is invisible trade. and it actually dominates a massive portion of the world's economic activity. We also have licensing and franchising, and you see these global giants every single day. Pepsi and Coca-Cola don't necessarily build their own factories everywhere. They use licensing agreements to allow local bottlers in foreign countries to produce their drinks. McDonald's uses franchising to perfectly adapt to diverse local markets all across the globe while maintaining their core brand. It's just an incredibly smart way to conduct international business without carrying all of that physical risk yourself.
Section 5. The Global Advantage.
It is truly a win-win scenario with dual benefits. Countries get vital foreign exchange to pay for their imports, they maximize the resource efficiency, and they create jobs for their citizens. But what about individual firms? Well, they get an escape route. When the domestic market is saturated and highly competitive, internationalizing is often the only way a firm can achieve rapid, significant growth and tap into fresh, willing buyers. Just look at how this builds into broader national strategies. Nations like Singapore, South Korea, and China saw that their domestic markets simply weren't large enough to absorb their massive production capabilities, so they successfully embraced an export and flourish strategy. They proved that looking beyond domestic borders is the absolute ultimate catalyst for phenomenal economic growth.
Section 6. First steps to going global.
Now, the least complex way to enter the global market is through exporting. It requires way less time and investment compared to setting up a whole new factory abroad, which keeps your risk incredibly low. You basically have two options here. First is direct exporting, where your firm directly approaches overseas buyers and handles all the paperwork and logistics. Or you can do indirect exporting, where you use specialized middlemen, like export houses, who handle all the heavy lifting for you. Alternatively, if Mr. Manchanda's son is right about saving on transport costs, but they really don't want the risk of building a wholly owned factory, well, they could utilize contract manufacturing. Also known as outsourcing, this is where a firm enters an agreement with local manufacturers in the foreign country, say over in Bangkok, to produce components to their exact specifications. It's actually fantastic middle ground.
So, we've seen the macro forces, we've looked at the friction points, and we've uncovered the immense opportunities. I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If you were in Mr. Manchanda's shoes, facing a domestic recession but armed with a genuinely great product, which border would you cross first? And exactly which entry strategy would you use? Think about how you'd apply everything we've explored today about the fascinating world of international business. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer. Keep learning, keep structuring your knowledge, and I'll see you in the next one.